Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our hosts, Governor. I will try to answer the questions. I guess actually I'll do it right now very easily. I don't know. Before I attempt to give a bit more than that, I thought I'd start by reflecting on this very unpredictable world in which we live. And I'll give 3 stories. Some of you may be aware that I have a slight obsessive interest in a certain football club, Manchester United. And who would have dreamt when we did the treble in 1999 that other bunch that Fergie used to refer to as the noisy neighbours would be doing that today? Certainly not Alex, and definitely not me. So that just shows you what can be out there. Second thing I would say is the last time I was in Athens was about 5 years ago, speaking at another event, although I'm not sure it was hosted by you guys. Could there be any economics events not hosted by you guys that are worth speaking at? Not any good ones. Well, at this particular event, I can't imagine there was a single person in the room that ever thought Greece would have any economic growth again. And in that regard, one of the few things I learnt from far too much time fully occupied in the financial services business is whenever you are in a crisis, most of you will get out of it. And along with that, never let a crisis go to waste. And it feels to me that Greece is kind of doing that. And the third thing to say in that regard, and it's direct promotion, at the peak of the crisis, when I was still fully engaged as actually GSAM, Goldman Sachs Asset-Management chair, I invested rather crazily in a way in a business called Hellas Direct. And the 2 guys that started it and run it are sitting somewhere in here. And I just met them briefly before, and it sounds like that's doing okay. So maybe that's a story for everybody to ponder on, more than the nonsense I'm about to try and answer on these 4 questions. And I'm going to do them in reverse order. Let me just put my glasses on to help me with the little notes I've scribbled. So the last one first. Is Europe's economy protected from shockwaves? Obviously not. That one I do know. Let me throw some stats about the state of the world at you. Slightly different tone than what Joan said earlier. For many years, and I still follow it now, even though it's 10 years since I stopped being fully in the financial services industry, one of the indicators I would watch every month would be South Korea's trade data. It's the fastest country to report trade in the world. They report on the first of every month. It tells you what their trade was the month before. And as I used to jokingly say, unless South Korea is trading with Jupiter, it's a pretty high-frequency indicator of the state of world trade. On the 1st of June, they reported that exports fell by 15.2% year-on-year in May. If there's any good news in that, it's that they fell at a slightly less rate than expected, albeit more than in April. Second global stat is from the monthly purchasing managers indices. Another, in the day when I did this thing for a living, highly reliable 3 to 6 month coincident indicator of the world. And the fact of the matter is the global manufacturing PMI was 49.6, which technically suggests world manufacturing is in some kind of recession already. However, the World Services Purchasing Manager Index was 52.8, which suggests it's doing okay. They are not compatible. One is going to go up, or the other is going to go down. I don't know which. It depends on a number of things. But the third stat to mention, as I relate it to this first question, the German IFO index, which is not only a very good high-frequency indicator of what's going on in Germany, but actually, because of Germany's importance to Europe, a really good high-frequency indicator of Europe, sadly, also fell last month. And the answer is pretty obvious, and Joan touched on it. Europe's biggest economy has been found out by two big things going on. One is its utter, in hindsight, excessive dependence on energy from Russia. And as an aside, its rather bizarre decision, in hindsight, to close down all its nuclear capability after the Japanese earthquake. And of course, and frankly, speaking as candid as always, it is rather ridiculous for Germany, Europe's biggest economy, to be effectively dependent on exporting to China. And Germany has just shown 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So the idea that Europe is insulated from stuff is, frankly, for the birds. The easiest of the 4 questions to answer. The third one, are we witnessing a global shift of power to the BRICs? Stamped on my forehead forever. It is now 22 and a half years ago since I had maybe the fortune or the coincidence of dreaming up that strange acronym. And I could spend all night talking to you about that. And my answer is I don't know. But what I would say, at a time where, again, people are talking about the dollar possibly being replaced by some currency to do with the BRICs. In fact, I think President Lula recently, very strangely, said there would be a BRICs currency. How would you like the job of being the central bank of that particular thing? Be a bit weird in my view. But as I jokingly say, actually often to many leaders, including those of the BRICS countries, it's a good job that China and India don't really ever agree about anything. Because if they did, and they were really serious, then we would be looking at a vastly accelerated rise of the power of the BRICs. Because, of course, within the BRICs, those 2 countries are increasingly becoming bigger shares of the world economy. And the Economist newspaper, no less, said at the weekend, and I agree with this, there is a pretty good chance that before this decade is over, that India is going to become the 3rd largest economy in the world. And it will certainly get pretty close to it. And whatever happens to China, short of outright complete disaster, it is going to be close to becoming as big as the US in dollar terms before the end of this decade. But in terms of some kind of major geopolitical force, despite the fact there is lots of talk of endless other countries becoming part of the BRICS group, I await them being serious about anything other than being a club which the US is not part of. Because that's what they all really do share in terms of enjoying. Second question, how long can inflation stay high and high rates with it? We had an expert giving you a pretty clear answer about that for Europe, and so I'm not going to try and compete with that, not least because I have no idea. Of the 4 questions, this is, in my opinion, actually the hardest. And I'll give you some completely contradictory pieces of evidence. As the governor said, And I think you used the phrase supply-side deflation. It's true. Who would have dreamt, 14 months after the invasion of Ukraine? Virtually every major global commodity price is significantly lower than it was a year ago. Significantly. Secondly, contrary to the intellectual brilliance of us strange economists, remember that idea that China would go from exporting deflation to exporting inflation? Guess which big economy in the world has got no inflation going on? China. And so it's not really entirely clear to me that we have got a truly global inflation thing going on. What we have had is some weird combination of a strange, unpredictable, and still unknown supply shock from COVID, and a big energy shock and food supply shock from Ukraine, combining with, dare I say, at the risk of provoking a central bank governor, far too much groupthink in global Western central banks about pursuing QE long after it ceased to do anything other than add to the perceptions of inequality in financial markets, in my view. The encouraging thing, which leads me to lean slightly to the optimists, and you touched on this again, Governor, the only few really reliable long-term surveys of inflation expectations that are out there are pretty stable. And it's not entirely clear to me that we'll look back in another couple of years and think, what was the scale of that fuss all about? At least I hope so. And then lastly, or the first question is, how possible have we got another 07-08 type crisis? I spent nearly 35 years, almost 24 hours a day in the financial services industry. I have no idea. What I would say to you is three things that will constantly be mixing together. Number one is greed and fear are always at the complete extremes of the world in which finance plays. And every now and then, we're right at one end, and every now and then, we're right at the other end. And whatever the brilliance of our regulators and central bankers, the idea that we're going to stop future crises is just ridiculous. Number two, it does seem, as the governor rather brilliantly articulated, that the financial system has kind of coped with what's been thrown at it so far, certainly way better than 07-08, way better than 98-99, way better than the one before that. However, the third thing is, during those 35 years of 24/7 in finance, I never went through a period where interest rates were rising, where the only thing you learned from it afterwards, that all of us lunatics in finance were nowhere near as smart as we thought before they started going up. And so if interest rates don't start peaking soon, we are definitely going to see more fallout from the financial system, probably in places that we didn't expect. And in that regard, maybe to discuss this further, how many people here would have even have heard of the name Silicon Valley Bank 6 months ago? To discuss. Thank you very much.